Okay, what we're starting off our lesson with today is going back through a couple of things that we did last semester with the philosophy of industrialists. We read some documents, and we're going to go over that, and we're going to talk about why these industrialists such as Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan became so powerful. We're going to talk about their tactics and how the government was, and then we're going to talk about our first major industry, the railroads. So what we're going to be looking at today is the rise of big business in the Gilded Age. We've already talked about the Gilded Age being this era that looks really, really good on the outside, but when we dig deeper into the history, into what's going on in politics and the methods of these industrialists, it's not going to look so good. So last semester we went over some philosophies of the industrialists, one being laissez-faire. We went over documents, and this one was where they wanted little government intervention. That if the government intervened the least, businesses could do what they want, and businesses being able to do what they wanted would allow for them to be more efficient. And them trying to be profit motive, their own self-interest would benefit society in the long run. And we see that this concept, the idea of lack of government intervention, meant businesses could essentially, the stronger businesses could take over the weaker businesses and offer goods at a lower price. And so laissez-faire goes hand in hand with social Darwinism, which y'all have seen in biology with survival of the fittest. But Herbert Spencer is going to apply it to the social world, saying that in society we should only let the fit survive. They're the ones who contribute most to society. They're not detracting from society, and they believe that, and we went over this last semester, that the weak, they suck too much out of society. They should not be helped, and they should die a natural death. And we see laissez-faire and social Darwinism kind of go together in this whole idea, lack of government, the biggest, the best, the most ablest will survive, and the government should not intervene to help the weak and the handicapped. And we're going to see one of our people who actually follows this philosophy is John D. Rockefeller. We have this political cartoon here that we saw last semester where his company, Standard Oil, again, at first was developing for kerosene, is able to survive by basically weeding out its competitors. And Standard Oil would come into major markets and undersell the competition, causing the competition to die out. And thus Standard Oil was able to capture all of those businesses and then be able to create a monopoly where Rockefeller owned 95% of the oil industry. Our next philosophy is a little bit more generous. It's called Gospel of Wealth, that was developed by Andrew Carnegie. We know Andrew Carnegie was one of our steel magnates, and we're going to see he felt that the rich, they had a duty to society, that anything extra after they provided for their own means and their family's means should be considered trust funds, money that has been entrusted to them to help others out. But he's not trying to help everyone out. He's only trying to help those who want to improve their lot in life, those who are willing to take some steps to advance themselves. He's not giving out to soup kitchens. He's not giving people just charity. He's only helping those who are going to reinvest in themselves. So as we see in this political cartoon, we see these little, I don't know if y'all see these little buildings right here that look like little Monopoly pieces, but those are libraries. He created a lot of libraries in the Northeast, and we're going to see, he says, those who go to the libraries are helping themselves get educated. You can't go to a library without using this stuff. And so he's trying to provide educational benefits to those who want to help themselves. He also gave out scholarships, and he's going to do a lot with his money in comparison to Rockefeller. So when we're looking at these guys who are in the Gilded Age, their wealth really is a massive amount of money in comparison to people today. So when we look at John D. Rockefeller, with the lack of rules, the lack of government intervention, laissez-faire and social Darwinism, he was able to amass a fortune of $190 billion. We see Carnegie, however, he was right up there with Rockefeller, but because he embraces gospel of wealth, we're going to see that he will spend a lot of it. Eventually, he sells Carnegie Steel. He sells it to J.P. Morgan. You see Vanderbilt with the railroads and his steamships was able to amass $96 billion. Look, there's Bill Gates. And I want you to think about Bill Gates. We know Bill Gates did Microsoft, but we know Bill Gates probably acts more like Andrew Carnegie, right? He gives away his wealth. So Bill Gates follows the philosophy of gospel of wealth. He isn't a social Darwinist. He isn't laissez-faire. And the last guy we have on there is J.P. Morgan. I know J.P. Morgan doesn't look like he has a lot, but he did amass a massive amount of wealth. And when eventually our government is going to go into a huge panic, he will bail out our government. And so what we're going to look at today, I know I just talked about the philosophies, laissez-faire, no government intervention. I've talked about social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and gospel of wealth, help those who want to help themselves. What we're going to look at is the tactics these guys had to be able to amass so much wealth. And again, a lot of this is unchecked. We look at our government today, and our government has a lot of rules on businesses. At this time, because the government embraced laissez-faire, our monopolists are going to be able to amass this wealth without any intervention. One of our biggest things is the trust. A trust is another word for monopoly. What happens here is several small businesses will come together to create a monopoly. So if y'all see in this political cartoon, it says the Steel Beam Trust. Smaller businesses, smaller steel mills came together and they formed an artificial monopoly so they could keep price high. We see the copper, we see Standard Oil. Rockefeller Standard Oil was actually a group of small businesses that came together where Rockefeller controlled most of it, and he was able to amass control of the industry, 95%. And when you keep on going down, there's the coal industry. Y'all probably know of Imperial Sugar. Imperial Sugar was a lot of small farmers, sugar farmers, who came together and created a monopoly so that they could keep prices high. They did other things that was pretty cool, such as standardizing the production of resources, saying that if you're going to be a part of this trust, you need to meet these standards. And so we're going to see the trust is an artificial monopoly of smaller people coming together. But when you look at this political cartoon, these trusts, monopolies, are essentially going to be able to have so much power, because look, if you look at the picture, you're realizing they're guys, right? But they kind of look like money bags. They're going to be able to amass so much wealth that they're going to be able to control, I don't know if y'all know what chamber this is, the Senate. They're going to be able to control the Senate. And so since these guys are paying the senators are going to do things in favor of big business versus the common man. Another method of power is a pull. Essentially, what a pull is when businesses divide up an area and they're going to say, okay, whoever controls this line right here, they control that area, and it creates a monopoly. They're the only railroad that runs that area. The second one, Southern Pacific, they're going to create a pull here. They control that area, and so they get a control price. Northern Pacific, they control that area, they control that price. And so when we divide up areas where there's different businesses controlling, and they create this geographical monopoly, they get a control price. One of the reasons why businesses like pools is because they're not competing against each other. When competition happens, prices go down. It benefits the consumer. So what we're going to see is businesses, they're going to come together and make agreements that, okay, in order not to have competition, let's divide up an area. We're going to fix prices so that we could all gain profits. And we see that this benefits the business and not the consumer. The railroad is a prime example of a pull where every area in America was divided up by the industrialists that were in the railroad magnates, and they decided what price was in their area, and basically they were able to gain more profit at the expense of the consumer. Again, the government is not doing much to intervene. we're going to see that our railroad is going to be made mostly by the government giving land grants. Another way that the railroads were able to be made is that our railroads got this land, they put it up as collateral. If y'all see this little pattern right here, they got to collect not all the land, but some of the land in a checkerboard fashion. They would sell that land or they would put it up as collateral and be able to get more money from banks as loans so that they could have money to develop the railroad beyond subsidies that were given from the federal government. Another way businesses were able to maintain power was through the rebates. What a rebate is, I don't know if y'all have ever filled out a rebate before, that you buy something and the government says, or a business says that you could send this paper in and they'll give you cash back. That's exactly what a rebate is. We're going to see rebates are given to preferential users, often discounting the price of an item for guaranteed business. One of the things that Vanderbilt will do and other railroad magnates is that they're going to go to Rockefeller. They know Rockefeller is going to be the biggest producer of oil, and at this time he needs to be able to put that oil, the kerosene, on the railroad to get it to his consumers. And so they're going to strike a deal with Rockefeller saying, hey, if you could get 80 carts, we'll discount the price on each cart for half of the value. And so Rockefeller, that was a great deal since he did not control the railroad, and they gave him preferential rates, giving him an advantage over smaller businesses. And this is one of the main reasons why he'll be able to dominate the oil industry. Eventually, Rockefeller will realize that the railroads were taking too much money for him, and he's going to establish something that's called a pipeline. And many of y'all know that the oil industry is very dependent on pipelines to be able to transfer their oil from where it is being produced to where it originates from. And so if you see this political cartoon, it actually has Rockefeller being a snake, because he's going to basically take out the railroad industry by establishing pipelines, and this leads to modern oil production. Our next method of power is called a holding company. A holding company is basically like a bigger business that controls over 50% of the voting stock shares in another company. So for example, Disney's like this today. Disney is a super holding company that actually owns several other companies, but they never created them. All they did was buy enough stock in that company to be able to control it. So look, here is an image of Disney. We all know that Disney owns Marvel. It never created Marvel, but it owns enough shares in Marvel to be able to control what Marvel does. We also know that Disney, it has its Disney companies, its Disney holdings, it has resorts, it has theme parks, it has other TV stations it owns. We also know that Disney did not create ESPN, but Disney has enough shares in ESPN to control it. We also see that Disney also controls parts of Fox Entertainment Group. So Disney, again, is a holding company. It's a business that was created. It's big enough that it could buy enough shares in another company to be able to control what it does. Here are some other examples of holding companies today. I don't know if y'all know that Coca-Cola, it owns a lot of different brands of soda beyond Coke, like Dasani, Fanta, Monster Drink. And again, this is more going into like just the Coke industry, but Procter & Gamble is a holding company. It actually started off with a lot of like Johnson & Johnson baby goods stuff. It started off with hair care, but then it goes into all these other items. But it never, a lot of those companies weren't created by Procter & Gamble. There were companies that they took over, that they owned 50% of shares for it. And I know this whole thing gets very loaded here. You could look at this image, it's on your PowerPoint, and we could get down a rabbit hole with this, but just know what holding companies are. Holding companies are major companies that control another company because they have ownership of 50% or more of their stock. Another way businesses at this time were able to gain so much control is this thing called interlocking directories. Basically, an interlocking directory is one business creates another business so that they could profit off each other. An example on your study guide was the credit mobilier scandal. The Union Pacific was a management company that the federal government had given land to and also had given subsidies to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They're a management company. They're not a construction company. So what they did is that they were going to hire a construction company to come in to build the railroad. And so when you think about that, you're like, okay, they're going to take bids. Usually most companies take the lowest bid, but they actually took the highest bid from the credit mobilier. Well, it turns out the reason why they took the high bid is because the owners of the Union Pacific were also the owners of the credit mobilier. So they charged the Union Pacific high rates. The federal government paid that, but again, that was paid by the public. And so many politicians were paid bribes to allow this deal to pass. And essentially, we paid $94 million to the Union Pacific, but it only cost $50 million for it to be created. So the credit mobilier, that was an artificial company created by the Union Pacific, got $44 million in profit that went back to the directors of the Union Pacific. So everybody was profiting off this scandal. And if y'all seen this picture, like there's all these politicians of this time and people of the Union Pacific and credit mobilier getting tons and tons of money or pieces of the cake in the scandal. And we're going to see many Americans are going to look like it's great that we're getting a railroad. We're getting to connect to California. We're getting the gold back into America. We're getting resources back to the East. But again, this was done at the expense of the taxpayer. Other methods of power that our monopolists are going to use to be able to get amass so much wealth is a type of combination. And this one's called a vertical combination or vertical integration or a vertical monopoly. What this means is that a person owns every single step in the process to make one item. This is exactly what Carnegie did. Carnegie, he actually owned the iron mines, the limestone quarries, the coal mines. He owned the shipping facilities. He owned the steel mill. And then he finally owned the place that made the steel into something feasible that could go out to production. He owned every single step in the process to get the middleman out. Another example, if you've ever heard of Swift and Armour, or their two major meat packing industries. I know I have Ace Meat Industries here, but what they did is they owned the cattle, the slaughterhouse, the refrigerated railroad cars, the warehouses, the meat packing plant, and finally the delivery wagons. A great example of this today is ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil owns every single step of the process to make oil. They own the oil fields, they own the oil refineries, they own the shipping, and then they own the gas stations to be able to sell oil. Another type of method of power is a horizontal combination. It's when one company produces the same product at different companies. So example here I have on the bottom is Yum Brands. You probably never heard of Yum Brands, but it's based out of Louisville, Kentucky. Yum Brands owns Pizza Hut, KFC, Taco Bell, Wing Street. They also own Long John Silver's, A&W. And you've probably seen them on the sides of highways that they have multiple places you could go eat together. Like even here in Waxahachie, you've probably seen Long John Silver's and A&W together because they're part of the same parent company. And so we're going into one industry. So Gaps like this, Banana Republic, and Old Navy, it's the same company that owns it, but they produce the same product at different levels. A great example of this in the Gilded Age was Rockefeller with his oil refinery. He owned different levels of it, and eventually when he's asked to break up, he makes different companies out of it. Texaco, Phillips, Conoco, 66 gas station. Okay, The last thing we have to talk about is the railroads. The railroads is actually the first major business that needs to take off so we could have integration of other businesses. We're going to see that its transportation was needed for us to get to our resources, to get things out to the market. It was also very expensive. The reason why it was very expensive, because we're trying to get to California, and no one wanted to build a railroad that went from Chicago through nowhere, through unorganized territory, for fear that it would be attacked. So when the government gives the land and is going to give subsidies, we're going to see that the railroad companies will take off. And they're going to use this land as collateral to be able to get money to build the railroad. So what we're going to see, our first transcontinental railroad is completed by the Union Pacific. And the Union Pacific basically goes from Chicago all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And the Central Pacific, we see it goes from San Francisco to the mountains. And we're going to see that this is the first major transcontinental railroad. Is not completed till after the Civil War. We see it takes a northern route because it was decided during the Civil War, when the South was out, that that's the route it will take. We're going to see all other railroads will be completed by 1900. We're going to see that this is going to have a dramatic impact on our nation. We're going to see that now our postal service can take off, the military traffic can take off. We're going to see the railroad is going to lead to towns becoming cities, such as Waxahachie, because the railroad stopped in Waxahachie will become very prominent in Ellis County. Other places that didn't get a railroad or a stop, like Maypearl, don't become so populated. They become ghost towns. We're going to see the West Coast is welded more firmly to the Union. Now we could get to California, which we could get ships out to Asia. We're going to penetrate the deserts where no one wanted to put a railroad in. We're going to see that this is going to lead to the growth of the West because it's going to allow people to move out there cheaply. It united our nation. It spurred the steel industry because all of a sudden we're going to realize that wood for the railroad is not feasible. You're constantly having to replace it. So we're going to get the standard gauge, and Carnegie's business is going to take off because the steel is going to be so dependable as a metal for the railroad. It's going to create an enormous market for raw materials. We're going to deplete a lot of our resources out in the West. It's going to spur people to come in and invest in America. It spurred industrialization. It spurred mining and agriculture. We're going to see the growth of cities, immigration. People can now move west. We're going to see that as we move west, a negative impact of the railroad is that the buffalo who moved along the plains actually got in the way of the construction of the railroad, and buffalo like to be warm, and so sometimes they would sit on the steel because the steel would get warm after trains would go over, and it could derail a railroad. So people like, I don't know if y'all ever heard Buffalo Bill Cody would go out west and he killed like 4,000 buffalo. But it also contributed to the near extinction of the Native Americans who depended on the buffalo, which we'll see more on a lesson on Friday. Another positive, it led to the growth of the cattle industry. Texas became very important because Texas had the beef. We're going to see the Southern Pacific come down to Texas, which the growth of the railroad led to the growth of the cattle industry, which led to the growth of Fort Worth and the stockyards. Another negative is destruction of the prairie, the destruction of our forests. Positive, growth of the lumber industry. Another positive is that we get time zones. Because the railroads are taking off at different times at local municipalities, we're going to see our federal government come in saying, okay, we need to standardize the time so that our railroads won't crash. People know, and there's a reliable time that things are coming in. People who control the railroads because of the pool were able to become millionaires. We're going to see corruption with the Credit Mobilier. We're going to see the extension of segregation on the railroad because of Plessy versus Ferguson. We'll see the separate travel arrangements. We're going to see travel encouraged, political campaigning change because now politicians could get on the railroad and move out and get to people. We're going to see the sharing ideas and improving quality life. Overall, on our impact of the road, it's going to be very positive, except for what happens to the Native Americans and our destruction of our resources. The railroad is going to be able to amass so much control in the government that actually our farmers are going to feel that they have lost control. And the farmers are going to develop a group for themselves. First, it was not political, it was a social group originally created for farmers because they were isolated. And we're going to see the farmers will eventually turn towards becoming a political organization. And one of the main reasons why they form a political organization is because the railroads were targeting them. They were not getting fair pricing from the railroads. And so we're going to see, for example, an eastern producer paid 95 cents per ton when shipping goods, but a farmer in the west paid $3.20 per ton. And they're going to be outraged on this. And so the Grange is going to really take on the railroad, saying that they're discriminating against farmers. The farmers had to pay more for the short haul than the long haul. And so the railroads basically did not favor the farmer. They favored the industrial giants. We're going to see that the railroads also controlled the elevator rates that for the farmers to store their grain. And so this is going to lead to the farmers becoming a political voice. The farmers are going to basically, if you look at this political cartoon, have real angst against the railroad, because if you look at the political cartoon, the railroad is in the hands of our government. And we're going to see many farmers are able to get control of the Grange, which will eventually get control in the state legislature. And we're going to see they're going to put up laws, putting price caps, regulating the railroad. Eventually, the federal government will come in. The Supreme Court will rule that Granger laws, the states regulating the railroad, was unconstitutional. Only Congress could do this. And so the farmers kind of lost out here. They're like, man, the railroad's in hands of Congress. We're really not going to be able to get anything. But what will eventually happen is Congress will pass the Interstate Commerce Act. This act prohibits rebates, that cash back that went to big businesses. They can no longer do that. It prohibits pulls. Remember where they divided up an area and it said that it eliminated competition to keep prices high? That's illegal. It required railroads to publish rates. By publishing rates, everybody was going to get charged the same. It outlawed unfair discrimination. Again, the farmers felt they were being discriminated because they were paying higher prices than the big businesses. It outlawed unfair rates, such as long hauls getting smaller fees versus short hauls. And it's going to establish a commission that's going to be able to go out there to make sure that the railroad is following this. So even though the farmers thought they were going to lose out because those Granger laws were considered unconstitutional, the Interstate Commerce Act is the first attempt of the federal government to regulate business. This is the opposite of laissez-faire. I promise you, you will see this as a test question about our government moving away from laissez-faire and trying to regulate the railroads. And a lot of this stemmed from the farmers stepping up to question the railroad and how it favored the big business.